Snow fell like ash over the ruins of Kursk, July 1943. German panzers advanced in formation, engines growling, treads grinding frozen soil into fire and mud. Through the smoke and burning wheat fields, Panzer Commander Hans Becker could see them. Soviet infantry, dug into shallow trenches, armed with rifles that looked pathetic against 40 tons of German steel. His tank lurched forward. Victory seemed inevitable. Then came the crack. Not the rattle of machine guns or the whistle of artillery, but a single sharp crack that punched through the morning air like a whip. The panzer beside Becker's erupted in flames. Another crack. Another tank disabled, black smoke pouring from its engine compartment. The German crew scrambled, confused. They weren't being hit by other tanks. They couldn't see the enemy's armor. What they didn't know, what terrified them once they realized, was that Soviet infantrymen, ordinary soldiers barely trained, were destroying their panzers with weapons they could carry on their shoulders. The Germans called it the Panzerbüchse des Todes, the tank rifle of death. The Soviets called it survival. This is the story of the PTRD-41, the crudest, cheapest, most effective anti-tank weapon of World War II, and how it shattered the myth of German invincibility. If you love stories hidden behind history's headlines, hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. To understand how a simple rifle changed the course of tank warfare, you must first understand the desperation that birthed it. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa unleashed 3 million German soldiers across the Soviet border. With them came over 3,000 tanks, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and the fearsome new Panzer VI Tigers. They tore through Soviet defenses like paper. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht had captured Minsk, encircled Kiev, and stood at the gates of Moscow. Soviet infantry had nothing to stop them. Standard rifles? Useless. Anti-tank grenades? You had to get close enough to die first. Soviet tank production couldn't keep pace with German advances. Factories were being evacuated east, workers fleeing ahead of the invasion. Stalin's generals faced a brutal math problem. How do you stop steel monsters when you have no steel monsters of your own? The answer came not from a general, but from 2 weapons designers, Vasily Dektyarov and Sergei Simonov. Both men had survived Stalin's purges by being brilliant and invisible. Now their country needed them visible. In August 1941, they received an order that sounded impossible. Design a portable anti-tank rifle. Make it simple enough for conscripts to use. Make it cheap enough to mass produce. And make it powerful enough to kill a panzer. They had 2 months. The concept wasn't new. During World War I, both sides had experimented with anti-tank rifles, oversized bolt-action weapons firing armor-piercing bullets. The German Mauser 1918 T Gewehr and the British Boys rifle had shown promise. But by 1941, tank armor had evolved. What worked in 1918 was obsolete. Dektyarov and Simonov approached the problem differently. Dektyarov designed the PTRD, a single-shot, semi-automatic rifle using a simple bolt mechanism. Strip away everything unnecessary. No magazine, no complicated gas system, just one devastating shot at a time. Reload manually, fire again. Simonov created the PTRS, a 5-round magazine-fed variant, slightly more complex but offering sustained fire. Both rifles fired the same round, the 14.5 by 114 mm cartridge, a bullet as long as a man's hand, tipped with a tungsten carbide core. At 1,012 meters per second, it could penetrate 25 millimeters of steel armor at 500 meters, enough to punch through the side and rear armor of most German tanks. The rifles were massive, over 5 feet long, weighing nearly 40 pounds. Firing one felt like being kicked by a horse. The recoil could dislocate shoulders. The muzzle blast left ears ringing for hours. But they worked. By November 1941, the first PTRD rifles reached the front lines. Soviet infantrymen were about to become tank hunters. Training was brutal and brief. Most Soviet soldiers handed a PTRD had never seen one before. They learned through necessity, in frozen trenches under fire. The manual was simple. Aim for weak points. Frontal armor? Forget it. The glacis plate of a Panzer IV was too thick. But the sides, the rear, the engine deck? Vulnerable. Target the vision slits, blind the crew. Target the tracks, immobilize the beast. Target the engine vents, set it ablaze. Target the fuel ports, watch it explode. Soviet commanders organized PTRD crews into specialized anti-tank hunter teams, usually 2 men, 1 shooter, 1 spotter. They operated independently, moving through rubble and snow, finding elevated positions, waiting. Patience was survival. Fire too early, you give away your position. Fire too late, the tank's machine guns cut you down. The ideal range was 300 to 500 meters, close enough to penetrate, far enough to escape. And there was another rule, unwritten but universally understood. Never fire at the same tank twice from the same position. Fire once, relocate, fire again from somewhere else. Stay invisible. Stay alive. By winter 1941, as German forces besieged Moscow, PTRD rifles were being mass-produced in evacuated factories beyond the Ural Mountains. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, assembled them around the clock. The stick of death was multiplying.
The German army didn't take the PTRD seriously at first. How could they? It was a rifle. Their tanks were fortresses. That arrogance died in the snow outside Moscow. Dezember 1941. Temperatures plunged zu -40 Grad Celsius. German tanks, designed für europäische Kampagnen, begannen fehlen mechanisch. Engines froze. Fuel gelled. Crews huddled inside, trying to stay warm. Und das, wann der PTRD-Cruise struck. Ein German Panzer III stalled auf einem frosenen Rot, engine smoking. The crew climbs out to inspect. Von 400 Metern entfernt, hidden in einem kollabierten Bahn, ein Sowjetsoldat stätigt sein PTRD gegen einen wuddenen Beam. Er exhaled slowly. Die Crosshairs sätteln auf dem Tanks Rear Fuel Tank. Ein Shot. Das Tungstencore puncht durch dünne Rear Armor. Fuel ignites. Der Tank wird zu einem Krematorium. German Reports von Dezember 1941 nennen Mysterious Fires und unerklärte Tank Losses. Crews reported hören scharfe Cracks, bevor ihre Vehikel kochten Feuer, aber sahen keine Enemy Tanks. Sam dachte, es war Sabotage. Andere blämten mechanische Fehler. Es trug Wochen, bevor German Intelligence pieced es zusammen. Sowjetinfanterie war killing Tanks. Der psychologische Impact war devastierend. Tank-Crews begannen zu fühlen hunted. Every pile of rubble, every snowdrift, every shattered building konnte ein PTRD. Paranoia sprach. Die Hunters hatten die Hunteten geworden.
By early 1942, the PTRD had become infamous on the Eastern Front. German tank commanders began adapting tactics. They avoided predictable routes. They moved faster through open terrain. They used infantry screens. But Soviet PTRD crews adapted faster. At Stalingrad, the urban ruins became a nightmare for German armor. Tanks couldn't maneuver through narrow streets choked with rubble. They moved slowly, predictably. And from third-story windows, from basements, from behind collapsed walls, PTRD shooters waited. Private Ivan Kuznetsov became a legend in his regiment. In 3 months of fighting, he claimed 11 German vehicles destroyed, 7 tanks, 4 armored personnel carriers. His method was patience. He would watch a street for hours, mapping the routes German tanks used.
Then he would position himself at a fatal angle, always aiming for side armor or engine compartments. "The first shot is science," he told a reporter. "The second shot is luck. There is never a third shot. By then, you're running or you're dead." Other PTRD gunners weren't as fortunate. The weapon's muzzle flash was enormous, a bright orange eruption that immediately revealed your position. Fire from an enclosed space like a building, and every German soldier nearby knew exactly where you were. Casualties among PTRD crews were catastrophic. Average life expectancy after first engagement? Less than 3 days. But volunteers kept stepping forward. The Germans responded with a technological arms race. By late 1942, new tank designs arrived on the Eastern Front. Panzer V Panthers and Panzer VI Tigers, with frontal armor exceeding 100 mm thickness. The PTRD couldn't penetrate them head-on. But Soviet crews found weaknesses. The Tiger tank, legendary and feared, had a vulnerable point: the rear engine deck. The massive engine required ventilation, and those vents were covered by thinner armor, only 25 mm. A well-placed PTRD shot could disable the engine, or worse, ignite the fuel lines. At Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, PTRD rifles played a crucial but invisible role. While Soviet T-34s and KV-1s engaged German armor directly, PTRD crews operated on the flanks. They targeted German supply vehicles, half-tracks, and disabled tanks awaiting repair. German Panzer commander Otto Karius wrote in his memoir, "We feared the Russian infantry more than their tanks. Their tank rifles could cripple a Panther if you gave them an angle. And they were everywhere, invisible ghosts with steel-piercing stings." The Soviet strategy was brutal mathematics: trade men for metal. For every PTRD crew lost, they destroyed or disabled German vehicles worth thousands of times more. Human lives versus industrial capacity. The Soviets had more of both. Not every PTRD crew fought conventionally. Some became hunters in the truest sense, stalking German armor through forests, across fields, into villages. Sergeant Maria Oktoberskaya was one such hunter. After her husband was killed at Kiev, she sold her possessions, bought a T-34 tank with her own money, and demanded to be sent to the front. But before she became a tank commander, she trained with a PTRD. "I wanted to understand how my enemies felt," she later said. "I wanted to know what it was like to face a tank with only a rifle." She spent 2 weeks in advanced PTRD training, learning to shoot from prone positions, from rooftops, from moving vehicles. She learned to calculate wind, distance, armor angles. And then she took her skills into combat, as a tank commander who understood exactly where her vehicle was most vulnerable. Other PTRD crews operated behind enemy lines, targeting German supply convoys. They didn't aim for tanks, they aimed for fuel trucks, ammunition transports, officer vehicles. Hit the logistics, starve the advance. Partisans in occupied territories used captured PTRDs against German trains. A single shot into a locomotive's boiler could disable an entire supply line. The PTRD wasn't just an anti-tank weapon. It was a weapon of asymmetric warfare, the equalizer that turned ordinary soldiers into strategic threats. By 1944, the PTRD's limitations had become undeniable. German tank armor kept getting thicker. The new Panther and Tiger II tanks had frontal armor exceeding 150 millimeters, impervious to PTRD fire from any angle. Even side shots became increasingly difficult. Soviet weapons designers scrambled to adapt. They developed improved ammunition, tungsten cores with better penetration, incendiary rounds that could set vehicles ablaze even without full penetration. But the writing was on the wall. The age of the anti-tank rifle was ending.
The future belonged to portable rocket launchers, weapons like the American bazooka and the German Panzerschreck. These could penetrate armor that rifles couldn't touch. Yet, the PTRD refused to become obsolete. Soviet soldiers discovered new uses. Against fortified positions, the PTRD's armor-piercing rounds could punch through concrete and brick. Against enemy infantry behind cover, it became a terrifying long-range weapon. One shot could penetrate a wall and the soldier behind it. In Manchuria, during the Soviet invasion of Japanese-held territories in August 1945, PTRD rifles devastated Japanese light tanks and fortifications. Japanese armor, thinner than German tanks, stood no chance. The PTRD, designed in desperation for a specific enemy, proved adaptable beyond anyone's expectations. A weapon born from necessity had become a symbol of Soviet resilience. The human cost of operating a PTRD was rarely discussed in Soviet propaganda, but it haunted the survivors. Private Dmitry Volkov, who served from Stalingrad to Berlin, recalled, "The rifle bruised your shoulder black and purple after a dozen shots. The noise, you never got used to the noise. It wasn't just loud, it was violent, like standing next to an explosion. Men lost hearing permanently. Some developed nerve damage from the recoil. The physical toll was matched by the psychological burden. PTRD crews knew they were priority targets. German doctrine specifically called for immediate suppression of anti-tank rifle teams. Snipers hunted PTRD shooters. Artillery strikes targeted their positions. Tank machine guns swept any suspected hiding spot. You fired once and then you ran, Volkov said. If you stayed in position, you died. We lost so many boys who thought they could get a second shot. Pride killed them. The smart ones learned, one shot, then move. Survival wasn't about bravery, it was about discipline. Yet despite the casualties, despite the weapon's growing obsolescence against heavier armor, despite the arrival of more effective anti-tank weapons, PTRD crews remained. They fought from Kursk to Königsberg, from the Dnieper to the Danube. They fought because retreating meant losing everything. They fought because the rifle, crude and brutal as it was, still gave them a chance. April 1945, the Battle of Berlin. Soviet forces encircled the city. German resistance was fanatical but crumbling. Yet tanks still prowled the rubble. King Tigers, Panthers, even captured Soviet T-34s pressed into desperate service. And PTRD rifles were there too. Corporal Alexei Belov positioned himself in the remains of a three-story apartment building overlooking Unter den Linden. Through a hole in the wall, he could see a Tiger tank blocking a major intersection, its massive gun commanding the avenue. Soviet infantry couldn't advance. Artillery was too dangerous with civilians nearby. Tank crews couldn't get a clear shot. Belov studied the Tiger through his scope. Frontal armor? Impossible. Side armor? Too thick. But then he noticed. The tank had been stationary for 30 minutes. The crew had grown complacent. One hatch was open, the commander's cupola, allowing ventilation. It was a shot that required not just skill, but insane luck. A 5-centimeter opening, 400 meters away. Moving wind, unstable firing position. Belov exhaled. Fired. The tungsten core entered the open hatch at a downward angle. What happened inside the Tiger was instantaneous and catastrophic. Secondary explosions. The crew never had time to scream. The intersection was clear. It was April 28, 1945. 3 days before Berlin fell. One of the last combat kills achieved by a PTRD anti-tank rifle in World War II. A crude weapon, an impossible shot, A war ending, one bullet at a time. When historians tally World War II's decisive weapons, they speak of T-34 tanks, Katyusha rockets, Ilyushin bombers. The PTRD rarely appears in those lists, but the numbers tell a different story. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union produced over 280,000 PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles. That's more than all Soviet heavy tank production combined during the same period. In certain battles, Stalingrad, Kursk, the Siege of Leningrad, PTRD crews accounted for up to 20% of German tank losses. 20%! These weren't sophisticated missile systems or strategic bombers. They were rifles, operated by regular infantry, often by soldiers with only weeks of training. The PTRD's true achievement wasn't just the tanks it destroyed. It was the psychological warfare it waged. German tank crews, once confident in their armor superiority, now hesitated before advancing. They avoided urban areas where PTRD ambushes were common. They wasted fuel on unnecessary evasive maneuvers. Fear became a weapon as effective as tungsten. And perhaps most importantly, the PTRD gave Soviet soldiers hope. When you faced a 40-ton Panzer with only a rifle, hope was a strategic resource. The PTRD proved that infantry weren't helpless, that courage and skill could challenge steel, that David could still wound Goliath. The revelation came slowly, emerging from declassified documents decades after the war ended. Soviet military analysts examining the Eastern Front's outcome identified the PTRD as one of three asymmetric force multipliers, weapons that provided disproportionate strategic value relative to their cost and complexity. The Germans had better tanks, better aircraft, better optics and communication equipment. But the Soviets had more PTRD rifles than the Germans had tanks. Manufacturing a Panzer IV required 55,000 man-hours of skilled labor, tons of specialized steel, and months of production time. Manufacturing a PTRD required 250 man-hours, basic steel, and 3 weeks. One German tank lost cost the Wehrmacht irreplaceable resources. One PTRD rifle lost? The Soviets had 100 more arriving at the front tomorrow. It was asymmetric warfare before the term existed. It was the principle that would later define countless conflicts: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. A technologically inferior force using simple, mass-produced weapons to neutralize a superior opponent's advantage. The PTRD was the ancestor of the RPG, the spiritual predecessor to every shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon that followed. It proved that in modern warfare, you don't always need the most sophisticated weapon. Sometimes you just need enough of the right weapon, and soldiers brave enough to use it. After Germany's surrender, thousands of PTRD rifles didn't retire. They were shipped east for the brief but brutal Soviet-Japanese War in Manchuria. Then to Korea, to Vietnam, where Viet Cong forces used them against American armored personnel carriers, to countless Cold War proxy conflicts across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Even today, over 80 years after its creation, PTRD rifles still appear in conflicts. Photos from Syria, Yemen, and Ukraine show fighters carrying the distinctive long barrel, still functional, still deadly against lightly armored vehicles. But for the Soviet soldiers who wielded them during the Great Patriotic War, the PTRD was more than a weapon. It was proof of survival against impossible odds. Veterans rarely spoke about their service with PTRD crews. The memories were too heavy, the lost comrades too numerous. Private Volkov, interviewed in 1992, shortly before his death, was asked what he remembered most about the rifle. He was silent for a long moment. "The sound," he finally said, "that crack, like thunder in your hands. Every time I fired, I thought, that's me. I'm still fighting. I'm still here." He paused. "For a while, that rifle made me feel invincible. even though I knew I wasn't. Especially because I knew I wasn't. The PTR-D-41 never received monuments, no museums dedicated solely to its story, no epic films chronicling the crews who carried it. History remembers the tanks, the battles, the generals. But it forgets the ordinary soldiers with extraordinary weapons, standing in the snow waiting for steel giants. The PTRD's legacy lives in a different place, in the design philosophy of every modern infantry anti-tank weapon. The principle that individual soldiers, properly equipped, can challenge armored vehicles. That asymmetric warfare isn't just possible, it's often preferable. The RPG-7, used in nearly every conflict since its introduction in 1961, owes its existence to lessons learned from the PTRD. So does the FGM-148 Javelin, the AT-4, the NLAW, and every other man-portable anti-tank system. They're all descendants of that crude, brutal, magnificent rifle designed in 2 desperate months in 1941. In the end, the PTRD proved something that military strategists are still learning. Wars aren't won only by the biggest weapons. Sometimes they're won by giving enough people a way to fight back. If this story moved you, share it so more people can discover the truths time almost erased. Subscribe to explore more hidden chapters of history. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. In the frozen silence of a Russian winter, a single crack echoed across the steppe, and David remembered how to kill Goliath.